Divorce papers? On my birthday? I said, staring at the courier with a perfect mixture of shock and hurt while accepting the manila envelope. There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. And as the delivery man awkwardly retreated, down my porch steps, I closed the door and allowed myself a small, knowing smile. My name is Olivia Blackwell, and my husband Marcus just made the biggest miscalculation of his life. But not in the way he thinks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I placed the envelope on my kitchen counter right next to the birthday cake I'd bought for myself earlier that morning. 38 years old today, and instead of flowers or jewelry, my husband of 12 years had sent legal documents declaring our marriage irrevocably broken. My phone buzzed with a notification, another fraud alert from my bank. I'd been getting them all morning. Your account ending in 4732 has been emptied. Balance 0.0. Of course it had. Marcus had finally made his move, emptying our joint accounts, maxing out our shared credit cards, and serving me with divorce papers on my birthday for maximum emotional damage. Classic Marcus, always with a flair for dramatic timing. What he didn't know was that I'd been anticipating this day for nearly 7 months. I'm a digital forensics investigator for one of the largest cybersecurity firms in Chicago, specializing in tracking financial crimes and data theft for Fortune 500 companies. My job involves finding invisible trails that criminals leave behind when they think they've covered their tracks completely. So when my own husband started displaying the warning signs of someone planning to disappear with our money, let's just say he wasn't exactly dealing with an amateur. The first red flag appeared last November when Marcus suddenly developed an interest in our retirement accounts after years of leaving all financial matters to me. I should be more involved, he'd said casually over dinner one night. It's not fair that you handle everything. His newfound financial responsibility might have seemed thoughtful if I hadn't noticed how he changed screens on his laptop whenever I walked into our home office, or how he'd started taking calls in the garage where he thought I couldn't hear him. I took a knife from the drawer and sliced into my birthday cake, German chocolate, my favorite. Marcus hated it, which is probably why I felt a particular satisfaction as I cut myself a generous piece. I carried it and the still-sealed envelope to my home office, where a folder labeled Contingency sat prominently on my desk beside my collection of birthday cards from friends and colleagues. The alerts kept coming as I ate my cake, watching the notifications pile up on my phone. Declined transactions, frozen accounts, failed transfer attempts. Each one was exactly what I had expected, precisely on schedule. Marcus thought he was being clever, but he had no idea what he was up against. I opened the envelope at last, scanning. The divorce petition with professional detachment. Irreconcilable differences. Equitable division of assets. Standard language, except for the part where he claimed I had abandoned the marriage emotionally. I almost laughed at that. The classic move of rewriting history to justify betrayal. Setting down the papers, I opened my laptop and checked a tracking app. The little blue dot that represented Marcus's phone was currently moving along Interstate 55, heading south out of Chicago, right on schedule. As I watched him flee, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. When I met Marcus Dresden at a technology conference in Boston 12 years ago, he seemed like everything I'd been looking for: intelligent, ambitious, and charming with his perfect smile and confident manner. He worked as a software developer for a financial services company, or so he claimed. His stories of corporate innovation and career success had impressed me, along with his apparent financial stability and clear vision for the future. "We're going to build something amazing together," he'd promised the night he proposed, just 6 months after we met. And for a while it seemed true. We bought a beautiful Victorian house in Chicago's North Shore, took luxurious vacations to places I'd only dreamed of visiting, and built what appeared to be a perfect life. I'd even considered cutting back my workload to start the family he kept talking about. but there were always inconsistencies I chose to ignore. How defensive he became when I asked about his student loans. How vague he was about former colleagues. How he never quite had paperwork for the investments he claimed were making us wealthy. "You don't trust me," he'd say whenever I asked questions, his tone making me feel guilty for doubting him. "After everything I've done for us." I finished my cake and pulled out my phone, dialing a number I'd memorized months ago. "Detective Rivera? It's Olivia Blackwell. Yes, he's made his move, exactly as we predicted. I'm sending you access to the tracking information now." I hung up and turned back to my laptop, pulling up the program that had been silently documenting Marcus's activities for the past 6 months. Every suspicious transaction, every hidden purchase, every secret communication with the other women, yes, there were 3 that I'd confirmed, all of it meticulously cataloged and time-stamped. The encrypted folder contained screenshots, recorded conversations, and financial records that told the story of a man who had been living a double life for years. What Marcus never understood about me was that my attention to detail wasn't just fussiness, as he liked to call it. It was a professional skill honed over 15 years of hunting down people who thought they were too clever to get caught. While he saw himself as the cunning wolf, he never realized he'd married the hunter. I glanced at the birthday card my mother had sent me, remembering her words when I'd first confided my suspicions about Marcus. "Don't confront him," she'd advised. Wisdom from her own experience with my father's similar disappearing act 20 years earlier. "Build your case first. People like that, they only respect the trap they can't escape." My phone rang. It was my colleague Zoe from the firm. "Olivia, the bank just called. Someone tried to access your secure accounts using Marcus's credentials. The honeypot worked. We've got everything. IP address, location data, the works." Smiled, thinking about the fake emergency fund accounts I'd created 6 months ago when I first discovered Marcus's plans. Accounts that looked legitimate, but were actually sophisticated monitoring systems designed to capture every piece of identifying information from anyone who attempted to access them. "Perfect," I replied. "And the offshore transfers he attempted this morning? All reversed and frozen, just like you planned. He's got nothing but the cash in his wallet and whatever he packed in that new suitcase he bought last week." As I hung up, I turned to look at the corkboard above my desk where a map displayed the locations of 3 previous Marcuses, or rather Michael Dorset, Matthew Daniels, and Martin Dixon, all aliases of the same man who had pulled this exact same disappearing act on other successful women across the country over the past decade. What my husband didn't realize when he married me was that he'd chosen the one woman who had both the skills and the resources to not only catch him, but to ensure he'd never do this to anyone ever again. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my attorney. It was time. For Phase 2. I spent my birthday evening not crying into a glass of wine as Marcus had likely anticipated, but methodically organizing evidence files while classical music played softly in the background. The irony wasn't lost on me that while he believed I was falling apart, I was putting together the final pieces of a case that would soon become his worst nightmare. My colleagues often joke that I have a digital bloodhound's nose for detecting fraud. As the lead forensic investigator at CyberShield Solutions, I've spent the past 15 years tracking down embezzlers, identity thieves, and financial fraudsters who thought their digital footprints were untraceable. Our client list includes 6 of the top 10 banks in the country and dozens of multinational corporations who call me when millions of dollars mysteriously disappear from their accounts. Olivia sees patterns where others see only noise, my boss had said during my last performance review. It was true. Where others saw random data points, I recognized signatures and behaviors. That's how I'd built my reputation and why the FBI occasionally brought me in as a consultant on their most complex financial crime cases. Marcus used to proudly introduce me at parties as the woman who catches bad guys with math instead of guns. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He found my work fascinating. In retrospect, too fascinating. What I had interpreted as supportive interest now seemed like research. He'd been studying my methods, learning my techniques, all while planning how to circumvent them. I pulled up the detailed timeline I'd created of our relationship, cross-referenced with financial irregularities and behavioral changes. The document was over 30 pages now, meticulously annotated with supporting evidence and witness statements. Detective Rivera had whistled when I first showed it to him 3 months ago. Most people bring us a suspicion and maybe some bank statements, he'd said. You've delivered a prosecutor's dream. My phone chimed with a text from Zoe. Facial recognition got a hit. He's checked into a hotel in Memphis under the name Mark Davidson. Same pattern as the others. I added this to my notes. Always a variation of the same initials, MD. Always a city with good airport connections to international destinations. Always the same methodical draining of accounts before disappearing. The pattern was so clear. To me now, though I'd been blind to it for years. The signs had started small. Marcus claiming his business trips were running long, unscheduled absences he attributed to client emergencies. Sudden changes in our financial accounts that he explained away as market adjustments. I'd believed him because I wanted to, because admitting the alternative meant facing that my marriage had been built on quicksand. The definitive moment came in January when I'd received a call from an estate attorney in Seattle about Marcus's application for a mortgage, while he was supposedly at a developer conference in Austin. One inconsistency too many had finally triggered my professional instincts. That night, instead of confronting him, I began my investigation. What I discovered was breathtaking in its scope. Marcus Dresden was not the successful software developer with family money that I'd married. His actual name was Michael Drainer, and he had perfected a particular type of long con, targeting successful professional women, building a life with them, then disappearing with their assets just when they were most vulnerable. I found 3 previous wives across the country, each with a similar story. Each had been left financially devastated and emotionally shattered, unable to even prove what had happened because Marcus, or whatever name he'd used, had methodically erased his paper trail. None had my particular skill set, and by the time they understood what had happened, he was already establishing himself with a new identity in a new city. The bathroom counter still held his toiletries, arranged with the precise organization he always maintained. The closet contained the clothes he hadn't deemed worthy of taking. To any observer, it would appear he had every intention of returning. This was deliberate, part of the gaslighting that would come next. The confused calls from his friends, wondering where he was, the suggestion that I had driven him away, the groundwork for him to claim I had forced him out if anyone started asking questions. I'd seen it all before in my casework, the careful construction of an alternative narrative, to make the victim appear unbalanced or unreliable, classic tactics used by confidence men to undermine potential accusations before they're even made. What Marcus never accounted for was that I had stopped being a potential victim the moment I recognized the first discrepancy. In the 7 months since, I had been playing a role, the oblivious wife, too consumed with her own career to notice her husband's betrayal. Every tear, every confused look, every acceptance of his flimsy excuses had been performance art designed to keep him complacent while I built my case and secured our assets. I checked the tracker again. He had left the hotel and was now at a bar downtown, probably celebrating his successful escape, perhaps already scouting for his next target. I sent the updated location to Detective Rivera with a brief message. Moving again. Probably won't stay at this hotel overnight. Pattern suggests he'll switch locations at least once more before attempting border crossing. My email pinged with a response from my attorney, Claire Watson. Documentation received. Filing first thing tomorrow morning. Judge Michaels is on. Rotation? She'll understand the urgency given the circumstances. Are you certain you want to proceed with all aspects of the plan? Once initiated, there's no pulling back. I typed a single word in response. Proceed. Unlike Marcus's previous wives, I hadn't just gathered evidence. I had constructed a comprehensive legal strategy with multiple contingencies. While he thought he was emptying our accounts, he was actually triggering forensic captures built into our banking system. While he thought he was covering his tracks, he was actually creating a documented pattern that matched his previous identities. And while he thought he was leaving me devastated and penniless on my birthday, he was actually walking into a coordinated law enforcement response that spanned 3 states. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of Marcus's downfall, but tonight, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. 12 years of my life had been invested in a marriage to a phantom, a carefully constructed fiction, designed to separate me from my money. The betrayal should have crushed me. Instead, it had awakened something, a determination not just to catch one con man, but to create a system that would protect others from experiencing what I and Marcus's previous victims had endured. This case would become more than personal justice. It would become my mission. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I rarely used. Agent Collins? It's Olivia Blackwell. I believe we're ready to implement Operation Paper Trail. Yes, he's taken the bait exactly as predicted. Tomorrow should prove very interesting indeed. Looking back, the warning signs had been there all along, subtle red flags that my analytical mind had registered but my heart had chosen to ignore. As I sat at my kitchen table the morning after my birthday, drinking coffee and reviewing my case notes, I could now see the pattern with painful clarity. It had started about 2 years into our marriage. Marcus had always been charming and attentive, quick with compliments and generous with gifts. But there was a calculated quality to his affection that I'd dismissed as simply being part of his methodical personality. The expensive watch for our anniversary that later turned out to be a convincing knockoff. The surprise vacation to the Bahamas funded by what he claimed was a work bonus, but coincided suspiciously with a temporary draw against our home equity line. Then there were the inconsistencies in his stories. Colleagues whose names changed between tellings, clients who never seemed to materialize at company events, professional accomplishments that couldn't be verified through a simple Google search. When questioned, Marcus had a remarkable ability to make me feel like I was being paranoid or unsupportive. "You're overthinking again, Liv," he'd say with that patient smile that now seemed so condescending in retrospect. "Not everything needs to be investigated. Can't you just trust me?" Trust, the word he'd weaponized against me for years. The first concrete sign that something was seriously wrong came last Thanksgiving. We'd hosted dinner for my colleagues from CyberShield, and Marcus had been his usual charismatic self, captivating everyone with stories of his work developing security protocols for financial institutions. The next day, my coworker Raj had approached me privately. "Olivia, some of the technical details your husband mentioned about the encryption system he's supposedly developing, they don't add up. The architecture he described isn't just flawed. Oh, it's impossible." I'd defended Marcus, claiming he'd probably simplified things for a non-technical audience. But Raj's concerns planted a seed of doubt that took root in my mind. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I searched through Marcus's home office while he was at the gym. What I found wasn't so much incriminating as it was concerning multiple prepaid phones stored in his desk drawer, a passport in his name, but with a birth date 2 years different from what I knew, and bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of with surprisingly large balances. When confronted, Marcus had explanations for everything. The phones were backups and test devices for his development work. The passport was a clerical error he hadn't bothered to fix. The accounts were investments he was managing for his parents that he hadn't mentioned because he didn't want me worrying about their financial situation. Each explanation seemed plausible on its own, and I wanted to believe him. But something had shifted in our relationship. For the first time, I began paying closer attention to the man I'd married. December brought more peculiarities. Marcus started taking calls in the garage or bathroom, his voice dropping to a whisper when I walked past. He installed a new password manager on his devices and refused to share the master password, claiming it contained sensitive client information. Most tellingly, he began asking detailed questions about my cases. Not with his usual passing interest, but with specific inquiries about how I tracked digital money movements and identified fraudulent accounts. "It's fascinating how you catch these people," he'd say, looking at my case notes with an intensity that should have alarmed me. "They must make some pretty basic mistakes." "Everyone leaves traces," I'd replied. "Digital footprints are almost impossible to erase completely if you know what you're looking for." His smile had faltered just slightly, a micro-expression of concern that registered in my subconscious. Almost impossible? So the perfect crime could exist? In theory, maybe. In practice, no. Patterns always emerge eventually. After the holidays, Marcus suggested we separate our finances more distinctly, for tax purposes. He created new accounts that he claimed would optimize our financial position, gradually transferring funds from our joint accounts. Each transfer came with elaborate explanations involving tax efficiency and investment opportunities that sounded plausible to anyone without my specific expertise. But tax optimization strategies don't typically involve moving money through 3 different banks before landing in accounts with limited spousal access. They don't require changing mailing addresses for statements or setting up new email accounts for financial communications. By February, my professional instincts had fully overridden my emotional attachments. I began documenting everything, creating a parallel record of our financial life that Marcus knew nothing about. I photographed statements before they disappeared from the mail pile, recorded conversations about money, and quietly installed tracking software on our home network. The most disturbing discovery came in March when I found a secondary phone hidden in a hollowed-out book in his office. Unlike the test phones he'd explained away earlier, this one contained messages to someone named Vanessa, discussing what appeared to be plans for a new life together. Photos showed a woman I'd never seen before, standing in front of houses they were apparently considering purchasing. "Just need to finish tying up loose ends," one message read. "Big payday coming this summer, then we're free." That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. This wasn't just about saving myself from financial ruin. It was about stopping a predator who had hurt others before me and would continue hurting more women if I didn't intervene. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove to the Chicago field office of the FBI and asked to speak with someone from their financial crimes division. The special agent who interviewed me, Diana Collins, listened without interruption as I laid out the preliminary evidence I'd gathered. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said when I finished, her expression carefully neutral, "what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated advance fee scheme combined with identity fraud and potentially interstate wire fraud. But I have to ask, why come to us instead of confronting your husband or simply filing for divorce?" I placed a USB drive on her desk. "Because this isn't just about my marriage. I've identified at least 3 other women with nearly identical stories. Different names, different cities, but the same man. Same methods, same pattern of behavior, same financial trails." Agent Collins plugged in the drive and skimmed through my preliminary findings. Her eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of surprise from the otherwise composed federal agent. "You've done quite a bit of investigation on your own," she noted. "It's what I do professionally," I replied. "But there are limitations to what I can access legally as a private citizen. I need help connecting all the dots and building a case that will actually stick. Otherwise, he'll just disappear and do this to someone else." Agent Collins nodded slowly. "If what you're showing me can be verified, then yes, this falls squarely within our jurisdiction. She paused, studying me carefully. But I should warn you, Mrs. Blackwell, investigations like this can take months, sometimes years, and they require the subject to remain unaware they're being investigated. I understand, I said. And please, call me Olivia. All right, Olivia. If we move forward with this, you'll need to continue your marriage as if nothing has changed. Can you do that? Can you go home to this man knowing what you know? I thought about Marcus's previous victims, women whose lives he'd destroyed while facing no consequences. I thought about Vanessa, his next intended target, who had no idea what she was getting involved with. Not only can I do it, I assured her, but I can help you build a case he'll never see coming. As the FBI began their investigation, I found myself reflecting on how completely I had fallen for Marcus's carefully constructed persona. Our relationship had seemed like a fairy tale in the beginning, the kind of whirlwind romance that friends envied and family approved of without reservation. We'd met at the Cybersecurity Global Conference in San Francisco 6 years ago. I was presenting a paper on emerging patterns in financial fraud, and he approached me afterward with thoughtful questions that demonstrated a genuine understanding of my work. He introduced himself as Marcus Dresden, lead developer for FinSecure Solutions, a boutique security firm that specialized in banking software. His business card and company website checked out. I'd verified that much at least, though I now knew both had been elaborate fakes. I've never met someone who understands both the financial and technical sides of security so completely, he'd said over drinks that evening, his blue eyes focused entirely on me. Most people get lost in either the code or the money, but you see how they intersect. That night turned into dinner, which turned into a breakfast date the next morning. By the end of the conference week, we were inseparable. Long-distance dating between Chicago and Boston, where he claimed to be based, quickly gave way to Marcus, transferring to his company's Chicago office to be closer to me. When he proposed 6 months later on a sunset cruise of Lake Michigan, I didn't hesitate. My mother had warned me it was too fast, but I'd dismissed her concerns as old-fashioned caution. When you know, I'd told her confidently. The painful irony of that statement wasn't lost on me now. Our wedding had been small but elegant, with Marcus charming every member of my family. Only 40 guests, none from his side. My parents passed years ago and I'm not close with extended family, he'd explained. I moved around too much as a kid to maintain deep friendships. Another red flag disguised as a sad backstory designed to evoke sympathy rather than suspicion. The first 2 years of our marriage had been blissful, or so I'd thought. We bought our Victorian home in North Shore, combining his money, which I now knew never really existed, with my actual savings. We traveled extensively, Paris, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, always staying in luxury hotels and dining at exclusive restaurants. I'd been impressed by his apparent financial success, never questioning how a developer from a small security firm could afford such extravagance. Investments, he'd always say with a confident smile when I expressed amazement at our lifestyle. I got lucky with some early tech stocks and learned to leverage that initial success. Now I understood that our luxurious life had been funded by a combination of my income, home equity loans against our property, and money from his previous victims. The trips, the expensive restaurants, the generous gifts, all designed to maintain the illusion of wealth while gradually positioning himself to access my actual assets. What truly chilled me was how he had systematically isolated me from people who might have noticed discrepancies in his story. My best friend, Jennifer, who had expressed early doubts about him, gradually saw less of us after Marcus subtly suggested she was jealous of our relationship. My brother Michael, with his background in finance, was kept at arm's length through manufactured scheduling conflicts whenever he visited Chicago. "Your family's great," Marcus would say, "but I just want you to myself sometimes. We work so hard. Don't we deserve some quiet weekends alone?" I picked up my phone and called Jennifer for the first time in nearly a year. "Olivia?" she answered, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "But I think it will be. I've missed you, Jen." Our conversation was careful at first, then increasingly open as I shared edited portions of my situation. I couldn't reveal the FBI investigation, but I could reconnect with someone who had tried to warn me years ago. "I never trusted him," Jennifer said finally. "There was something performative about how he acted, like he was playing a role instead of being a person." "Why didn't you push harder?" I asked, not accusingly but genuinely curious. "I tried, but you were so happy, Liv. And after a while, he made it clear I wasn't welcome in your lives. The invitations stopped coming. You were always busy when I suggested getting together. Eventually, I got the message." I closed my eyes, pained by the realization of how effectively he had managed my relationships. "I'm sorry, Jen. I didn't see it." "Of course you didn't. That's how men like him operate. They isolate their targets." After reconnecting with Jennifer, I reached out to my brother Michael as well. His response was immediate. "I'm coming to Chicago. This weekend. No arguments." 3 days later, we sat in a cafe several neighborhoods away from my home, where there was no chance of running into Marcus. I had told my husband I was attending a work conference in Milwaukee, my first direct lie in our relationship, and one that felt surprisingly easy given the circumstances. Michael listened intently as I shared the sanitized version of my discoveries, omitting the FBI's involvement, but making it clear I was building a case. "I never understood how a guy who claimed to be so successful had no digital footprint in the finance world," Michael said, shaking his head. "I looked him up after your wedding, you know. Found almost nothing beyond that fancy website for his company and a sparse LinkedIn profile." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. Michael's expression turned regretful. "I did, remember? When you first introduced us. You accused me of being overprotective and judgmental without giving him a chance." The memory surfaced. A tense dinner where Michael had asked too many specific questions about Marcus's background and investment strategies. I'd been angry at my brother afterward, accusing him of trying to sabotage my happiness. "I'm so sorry." "Michael." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Don't apologize. Con men are good at what they do, and this one targeted you specifically because of your success. What matters is that you figured it out. But not before marrying him and combining our finances. Maybe, but you caught on before he could do maximum damage. From what you've told me, he was planning something much bigger than just draining your accounts." Michael wasn't wrong. According to the patterns the FBI had identified in his previous cases, Marcus typically spent 3 to 5 years with each victim, gradually increasing his financial control before disappearing with everything he could access. Isaiah was only at year 3, catching him in the preparation phase rather than the execution. "What do you need from me?" Michael asked. "Right now, just your support. And maybe some help understanding how he might be moving money internationally. I have suspicions, but your expertise in global finance would be valuable." For the next 2 hours, my brother outlined various methods for obscuring financial transfers across borders, knowledge that proved invaluable as I continued working with Agent Collins. By the time I returned home Sunday evening, I had re-established crucial connections with people who knew the real me, people Marcus had carefully pushed away. I also had a clearer understanding of exactly how sophisticated his operation was and what I was up against. "Good conference?" Marcus asked casually as I unpacked my overnight bag. I gave him the smile I had perfected over the past months, warm enough to seem genuine but not so enthusiastic as to appear suspicious. "Productive," I replied, though I missed being home. He hugged me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. "I missed you too. The house feels empty without you." As I leaned back against him, playing the role of loving wife, I wondered how many other women had received this exact same embrace, heard these same words, never suspecting they were merely lines in a long-running performance. "I was thinking," he said, his tone deliberately casual, "maybe we should look at consolidating some of our investment accounts. My financial advisor suggested it might be more efficient." And there it was, the next move in his carefully orchestrated game, a game he still believed he was winning. "Sounds interesting," I replied, turning to kiss his cheek. "Why don't you tell me more about it over dinner?" The pivotal moment that transformed my suspicions into certainty came on a rainy Tuesday. In April, 4 months before my birthday, I had been carefully documenting Marcus's activities while maintaining the appearance of an oblivious wife, but I still lacked the smoking gun that would definitively connect him to his previous identities and victims. That morning had started, like any other. Marcus kissed me goodbye, mentioned a client meeting downtown, and said he might be home late. I waited 20 minutes after he left, then accessed the secure laptop I kept hidden in a locked cabinet in my home office. A computer Marcus knew nothing about, connected to a separate network from our home system. I'd been systematically working through his digital trail, carefully tracing account movements and communications when Agent Collins called. "Olivia, we've got something. Can you talk?" I confirmed I was alone and switched to speakerphone. "What did you find?" "We located Rebecca Winters in Seattle, the woman we believe was married to your husband when he went by the name Matthew Daniels. She's agreed to cooperate, but she's nervous. Apparently, she received threatening messages whenever she tried to investigate what happened to her money after he disappeared." "Is she willing to meet with me?" I asked, already calculating how I could arrange such a meeting without Marcus. Becoming suspicious? "That's the thing. She's actually flying to Chicago tomorrow for an unrelated conference. She's willing to meet you, but only in person, no digital communications. She doesn't trust phones or email after what happened." This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. A chance to connect directly with one of Marcus's previous victims and compare notes. "I'll make it work. Send me the details." After arranging to meet Rebecca the following day, I returned to my investigation. I was focused on a series of transfers Marcus had made to what appeared to be a legitimate investment company called Meridian Capital. Something about the company structure had been bothering me. It seemed too perfect, too clean. I decided to dig deeper into Meridian's corporate registration. My position at CyberShield gave me access to databases most people couldn't touch, including international corporate registries. What I found made my blood run cold. Meridian Capital had been established 3 years ago, just after Marcus and I were married. The company was registered in Delaware, but owned by a shell corporation in Belize, which in turn was controlled by another entity in the Cayman Islands. Complex, but not unusual for offshore structures. What was unusual was that when I cross-referenced the Cayman company's formation date with Marcus's previous timelines, I discovered it had been created just 2 weeks after he disappeared from Rebecca Winters' life in Seattle. The company's registration used a unique alphanumeric code as part of its identifier, a code that included Marcus's actual birth date and his mother's maiden name, based on the true identity the FBI had uncovered. This wasn't just another investment. This was his escape hatch, his repository for stolen funds. And based on the account transfers I'd been monitoring, he had been steadily feeding it with our money for years. My money. With hands that trembled slightly, I documented everything and sent an encrypted file to Agent Collins. Then I did something, risky but necessary. I drove to our bank and requested a complete audit of all account activities for the past 3 years, using my position as joint account holder. "This is unusual, Mrs. Dresden," the bank manager said, studying me carefully. "Is there a specific concern I should be aware of?" I had prepared for this. Nothing serious, just some discrepancies I noticed while preparing our taxes. My husband handles most of our day-to-day finances, but I like to verify everything for the IRS. I laughed lightly. You know how they can be about documentation. 3 hours later, I left with a comprehensive record of every transaction Marcus had conducted. The pattern was now unmistakable: systematic draining of our joint resources through seemingly legitimate investments, all ultimately flowing to Meridian Capital and its web of associated entities. The next day, I met Rebecca Winters at a quiet cafe near the Art Institute. I recognized her immediately from the driver's license photo the FBI had shown me, a woman in her early 40s with short auburn hair and the wary expression of someone who had learned hard lessons about trust. "Olivia?" she asked as I approached. "Her table." "Rebecca. Thank you for meeting me." We studied each other for a moment, two successful women who had fallen for the same predator. Rebecca had been a senior architectural engineer at a major Seattle firm before Marcus, or Matthew as she knew him, had systematically dismantled her life. "He looks exactly the same," she said, staring at the recent photo of Marcus Idintatiar, placed on the table. 3 years later, and he hasn't changed a bit. Even wears the same style of watch. "Tell me everything," I said, "from the beginning." For the next 2 hours, Rebecca detailed her 3-year relationship with the man I knew as Marcus. The similarities were uncanny. The whirlwind romance, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the seemingly successful career that never quite held up to scrutiny, the increasing control over finances. "The end came on my 40th birthday," she said, her voice hollow with remembered pain. "I came home to an empty house and most of our accounts drained. He left a note saying he couldn't pretend anymore, that he'd never loved me. 2 days later, I discovered our home equity line maxed out and credit cards in my name that I'd never applied for, all completely drained." My stomach tightened. My 40th birthday was just 4 months away. The timeline fit perfectly with what I'd been observing. Marcus was preparing for his endgame, just as he had with Rebecca. "Did you go to the police?" I asked. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "Of course. They took a report, but said it was mostly a civil matter since we were legally married, and he had authorized access to our accounts. When I pushed, strange things started happening. My work emails were hacked, my car was broken into, I received anonymous threatening messages. Eventually, I gave up. The emotional and financial cost was too high." She pulled out a worn leather portfolio and handed it to me. "This is everything I have. Photos, account statements, the police report, everything." I kept it all, even though I tried to move on with my life. Something told me he'd do this again, and someday someone might need this information. As I opened the portfolio, a photograph slipped out. Rebecca and Matthew on their wedding day. The man was undeniably Marcus, though with slightly longer hair and no beard. The surge of anger I felt was tempered by vindication. This was the evidence that would help seal his fate. "There's something else you should know," Rebecca said, her voice dropping. "About 6 months before he disappeared, he began asking about my retirement accounts and life insurance policies. He even suggested increasing my coverage, saying it was the responsible thing to do as we got older." A chill ran through me. The FBI had suspected the insurance angle but hadn't confirmed it. If Marcus's pattern was escalating from straight financial fraud to something potentially more sinister, the stakes had just gotten much higher. "Rebecca, would you be willing to make a formal statement to the FBI? Today, if possible?" She hesitated, only briefly before nodding. "That's why I brought everything. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to stop him from hurting anyone else." As we left the cafe, I called Agent Collins to arrange an immediate meeting. The pieces were falling into place faster than I had anticipated, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of concern for my own safety. If Marcus realized how much I knew, how close the authorities were getting to him, what would he do? I checked my phone and saw 3 missed calls from Marcus. A text followed as I watched. "Where are you? Thought we were having lunch today. Everything okay?" I typed a quick response. "Sorry, emergency at work. Client security breach. Might be late tonight. His reply came almost instantly. No problem. Take care of business. I'll handle dinner. Love you. I stared at those last two words. A casual sentiment from a man who had never meant it. Not with me, not with Rebecca, not with any of his victims. A man who saw love as nothing more than a tool for manipulation. It was time to accelerate the plan. After my meeting with Rebecca, I knew I needed to prepare more aggressively. Marcus wasn't just planning to drain our accounts. He was setting up his most sophisticated exit strategy yet, and I had only a limited window to get ahead of him before he made his move. Agent Collins and I met in a secure room at the FBI field office later that afternoon. Rebecca had given her statement, providing crucial testimony that established a pattern across state lines, elevating Marcus's crimes from local fraud to federal offenses. Based on the evidence and Rebecca's statement, we can now officially open a full investigation, Collins said, spreading documents across the table. But there's a complication. If your husband follows his established pattern, he's likely to disappear within the next 60 to 90 days. We need more time to track down his other victims and map his entire financial network. My birthday is in 4 months, I noted. If he follows the same pattern he used with Rebecca. Collins nodded. That would be his likely exit date. We need to let him think his plan is working while we build our case. Can you maintain your current situation at home without raising his suspicions? I've been doing it for months already. I straightened in my chair, my resolve hardening. But I want to do more than just wait. I want to set a trap that he can't escape. What emerged from that meeting was Operation Paper Trail, a multifaceted strategy designed not just to catch Marcus, but to dismantle his entire operation and recover assets for all his victims. The plan had several components. First, I would create a series of financial honeypots, accounts that appeared valuable but were actually monitored by both CyberShield and the FBI. I would casually mention these accounts to Marcus, describing them as emergency funds or recent inheritances that I hadn't previously disclosed. Second, working with my bank's fraud department and federal authorities, we placed sophisticated tracking on all our legitimate accounts. Every withdrawal, transfer, or access attempt would be recorded with detailed metadata that could establish chain of custody for prosecution. Third, I began subtly securing my actual assets without raising red flags. I moved my retirement accounts to new institutions under enhanced security protocols, updated my will with a trusted attorney, and transferred my most important personal items to a safe deposit box Marcus knew nothing about. Most crucially, I began a careful documentation process of our daily life. Hidden cameras installed during Marcus's regular Thursday golf game captured his access to my home office. A dedicated recording device in my car preserved our conversations. Every text, email, and phone call was backed up to secure servers. You're essentially creating a surveillance state in your own home, Agent Collins observed when I detailed my preparations. No, I'm creating an insurance policy, I corrected her. If Marcus follows his pattern, he'll attempt to portray me as unstable or financially irresponsible when he disappears. I need irrefutable evidence of exactly what happened. The most difficult part was maintaining emotional equilibrium while living with a man I now knew to be a predator. Each morning I woke up beside him required a mental reset, a reminder that I was playing a role in a performance with life-altering stakes. You seem distracted lately, Marcus commented one evening in May as we prepared dinner together. His tone was concerned, but I caught the calculating assessment in his eyes. I offered the excuse we had prepared for this inevitable observation. Work has been intense. We're tracking a new fraud pattern that's similar to something I saw years ago. It's like watching the same movie with slightly different actors. His knife paused briefly over the vegetables he was chopping. That sounds frustrating. Anything you can share about it? Just the usual. Someone finding ways to move money through legitimate-looking channels before disappearing with everything. I kept my tone casual, watching his reaction from the corner, of my eye. The interesting part is how they establish trust first, years of building relationships just to execute a complex theft. People can be surprisingly patient when the payoff is big enough, he replied, resuming his chopping with measured strokes. The victims never see it coming, I continued, pushing slightly further. They trust completely until the moment everything vanishes. Marcus glanced up, his expression perfectly calibrated to show empathetic concern. That must be devastating. To realize someone you trusted was just waiting for the right moment? Our eyes met briefly, and I felt a chill at the absolute emptiness behind his practiced compassion. This man had shared my bed, my home, and my life for years, all while methodically planning my financial destruction. It is devastating, I agreed, softly. But the case has taught me something important. What's that? Digital footprints are impossible to erase completely. Everyone leaves traces, and eventually, patterns emerge that tell the real story. A flicker of something, perhaps concern, crossed his features before his charming smile reasserted itself. Well, I'm glad the bad guys are no match for you. Throughout June and July, I carefully laid breadcrumbs about financial matters that would pique Marcus's interest without arousing suspicion. I mentioned an aunt who had left me stock certificates found during a recent cleaning of my mother's attic. I created fake emails from my financial advisor about a special investment opportunity that had yielded surprising returns. I even, accidentally, left bank statements visible showing new accounts with healthy balances. Each piece of bait was carefully monitored. We tracked every time Marcus accessed my computer, searched for the fabricated accounts, or made calls to financial institutions using my personal information. Simultaneously, the FBI was building connections to Marcus's previous identities. They located a third victim in Portland, Grace Chen, a successful restaurateur who had lost nearly $900,000 to Martin Dixon 5 years earlier. Like Rebecca, she had been threatened when she attempted to pursue legal action, eventually abandoning her efforts out of fear and exhaustion. By early August, our trap was fully set. All the honeypot accounts were in place, the monitoring systems were active, and Marcus was exhibiting the telltale signs of a predator preparing to strike. He had begun making more frequent business trips, often returning with expensive gifts as if compensating for his absences. He suggested we update our wills and insurance policies just to be responsible. He even proposed a romantic getaway for my upcoming birthday, a trip that would require me to bring my passport and leave my secure work devices at home. I thought we could use a real escape, he said, showing me brochures for exclusive resorts in the Maldives. 40 is a milestone, worth celebrating properly. The trip would never happen, of course. Based on his pattern, Marcus would disappear shortly before my birthday, taking everything he could access and leaving me with nothing but debt and broken dreams. What he didn't realize was that I had spent the past 6 months ensuring that his long-established pattern would finally be broken, not by him, but by me. 2 weeks before my birthday, I received an unexpected call from Agent Collins. "Olivia, there's been a development. We've identified unusual activity in Marcus's shell companies. Large sums are being consolidated and prepared for transfer. He's moving ahead of schedule." My heart raced. "How much time do we have?" "Days, not weeks. Is everything in place on your end?" I thought about the elaborate trap we had constructed, the careful legal preparations, the documentation that would ensure Marcus could never escape the consequences of his actions. "Everything's ready," I confirmed. "Let him make his move. We'll be waiting." That night, I watched Marcus across the dinner table. Handsome, charming, and completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I allowed myself a genuine smile. "What's that smile for?" he asked, reaching for my hand across the table. I squeezed his fingers gently, thinking of the tracking software that was now documenting his every digital move, the financial tripwires he was about to trigger. The federal agents preparing to intercept him. Just thinking about the future, I replied truthfully. Everything's about to change. He nodded, clearly interpreting my words through the lens of his own plans. Change can be good. Sometimes you have to close one chapter before starting another. I couldn't agree more, I said, raising my wine glass in a toast. To new beginnings. If only he knew what kind of beginning awaited him. The divorce papers arrived by courier on my birthday morning, exactly as I had anticipated. What I hadn't expected was how swiftly Marcus would move to empty our accounts, not waiting for me to be emotionally devastated by his abandonment, but executing both maneuvers simultaneously. It was a deviation from his previous pattern that might have caught me off guard had I not been so thoroughly prepared. Within an hour of receiving the papers, I was seated in a conference room at my attorney Claire Watson's office, watching the digital fraud alerts roll in on my phone. He's accessing everything simultaneously, I noted, showing Claire the notifications. Joint accounts, credit lines, investment portfolios, all being drained at once. Claire nodded, her expression grimly satisfied. Perfect. Each unauthorized access is being logged by the bank's fraud team and the FBI monitoring system. He's building our case for us with every transaction. My phone rang. Agent Collins calling for an update. We've got his location, she said without preamble. He's at a branch of First Meridian Bank downtown, attempting to withdraw the maximum cash amount from your joint accounts. The manager has been instructed to process the transactions while documenting everything. We've also identified 3 separate wire transfers he initiated this morning to offshore accounts. What about the honeypot accounts? I asked. He accessed those about 20 minutes ago. The tracking protocols captured everything: IP address, device information, facial recognition from the bank's security cameras. It's all admissible evidence. I felt a curious sense of calm as I watched the systematic dismantling of my financial life. Or rather, what Marcus believed to be my financial life. The actual damage was minimal, as my most valuable assets had been secured months ago. Yeah, we move on him now? I asked. Not yet, Agent Collins replied. We want to follow the money trail completely. Our financial crimes team is tracking the wire transfers in real time, mapping his entire network. We need to let him think he's succeeded before we close the net. After ending the call, I turned to Claire. How do we respond to the divorce petition? And smiled, the confident expression of a predator who spots wounded prey. Exactly as we planned. We file our counterpetition with evidence of financial fraud and request an emergency freeze on all marital assets. Judge Levine is already expecting our filing. He'll sign the order immediately. By noon, the legal countermeasures were in motion. While Marcus thought he was blindsiding me with divorce papers and empty accounts on my birthday, my legal team was submitting over 200 pages of documented financial fraud to the court. By 2 p.m., a judicial order had frozen every account associated with Marcus Dresden or any of his known aliases. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at Lakeview Coffee at 4 p.m. Come alone. Marcus. Of course. I forwarded the message to Agent Collins, who responded immediately. Perfect. This accelerates our timeline. We'll have plainclothes officers in position, but they won't intervene unless your safety is threatened. Remember the plan. Let him think he still has leverage. At precisely 4 p.m., I walked into Lakeview Coffee. The small shop was half empty, with a few students typing on laptops and a couple of business people engaged in quiet conversation. Marcus sat in the corner, his back to the wall, watching the door with the hyper-vigilance of someone who knows they've crossed a line. He'd changed his appearance slightly. His usual designer suit replaced by casual jeans and a dark sweater. His normally clean-shaven face showing stubble, and sunglasses perched on top of his head despite the overcast day. Ready to disappear into anonymity after our meeting. His expression flickered between concern and calculation as I approached, trying to gauge whether I was devastated or angry, looking for the emotional vulnerability he could exploit. What he couldn't have anticipated was the perfect calm I felt, the absolute certainty that came with months of preparation. "Olivia," he said, standing as I reached the table. "Thank you for coming." I sat down without offering my hand or any other greeting. "You've been busy today, Marcus. Or should I call you Michael or Matthew? I'm not sure which name you're using at the moment." His face froze for a split second, just long enough to confirm that my words had hit their mark. Then his features rearranged into concerned confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Listen, I know the divorce papers were a shock, and I'm sorry about the timing, but—" "Let's not waste time," I interrupted, my voice level. "I know exactly who you are and what you've done, not just to me, but to Rebecca in Seattle. And Grace in Portland, and likely others I haven't identified yet." Marcus's practiced composure slipped momentarily, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features before he recovered. "You're upset, and I understand that. Divorce is emotional. But these accusations aren't accusations," I finished for him. "They're statements of fact, backed by evidence currently being reviewed by federal prosecutors." I placed my phone on the table between us, screen up, showing the active fraud alert still coming in. "You've been quite thorough today. Our accounts, credit lines, investment portfolios. You didn't miss much." His approach shifted instantly, abandoning the confused innocence for something more pragmatic. "Olivia, we both know marriages end. Financial disagreements happen. But turning this into some kind of criminal matter won't help either of us." "That might have worked with the others," I acknowledged, framing it as a relationship gone wrong rather than premeditated fraud. "But you made a fundamental mistake. This time, Marcus." "What's that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "You married a forensic financial investigator. Someone whose entire career is built around tracking exactly the kind of schemes you operate." For the first time, I saw genuine fear flash across his face. Not the calculated expressions he normally displayed, but raw recognition of a serious miscalculation. "Whatever you think you know," he began. "I know everything," I stated simply. "Your real identity, your previous victims, the elaborate network of shell companies you've established to hide stolen funds, the threats you made to silence women who tried to expose you, every digital footprint, every transaction, every false identity document, all of it." Marcus glanced toward the door, clearly calculating his escape options. "Don't bother," I said quietly. "There are federal agents both inside and outside this cafe. You're not walking away this time." His expression hardened, the charming facade dropping completely to reveal the cold manipulator beneath. "You have no idea what you're doing, Olivia. If you had simply accepted the divorce, taken whatever settlement I offered, you could have moved on with your life. Now you've complicated things for both of us." The thinly veiled threat might have frightened me once, but now it only confirmed everything I already knew about the man I'd married. "That's where you're wrong," I replied. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I've been doing it for months while you thought I was oblivious to your plans. Every account you accessed today was monitored. Every dollar you transferred has been tracked. Every identity you've created has been documented and linked back to you." I leaned forward slightly. "You didn't just marry the wrong woman, Marcus. You chose someone who could dismantle your entire operation. And that's exactly what I've done." His hand moved suddenly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. I tensed, but he merely withdrew his phone, glancing at it briefly before returning his attention to me. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice now businesslike. "There must be something you're after, or you wouldn't have agreed to meet me alone." "I'm not alone," I reminded him. "And what I want is justice, not just for myself, but for every woman you've targeted. The only question remaining is how difficult you want to make this for yourself." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not his usual charming expression, but something colder and more genuine. "You know, I almost wish I had actually loved you," he said. "You're more impressive than I gave you credit for." "Save the compliments," I replied, standing up. "I'll see you in court, Marcus. Or whatever your real name is." As I walked away, I heard him call after me, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "This isn't over, Olivia. People like me, we always have contingency plans." I paused at the door, turning to look at him one last time. "So do I, Marcus. So do I." Outside, Agent Collins waited beside an unmarked car. "How did it go?" "Exactly as expected," I replied. "He's rattled but dangerous, and I think he just admitted to having backup plans we haven't identified yet." She nodded grimly. "We'll move on him tonight. In the meantime, you're coming with us. To a secure location. Based on his history, this is when he's most likely to escalate beyond financial crimes." As we drove away, I watched through the rear window as two plainclothes agents entered the coffee shop. Marcus would be under surveillance from this point forward, his every move tracked until formal charges could be filed. I had confronted the man who had plotted my financial ruin and walked away intact, but the most dangerous phase of our operation was just beginning. After my confrontation with Marcus, the case expanded far beyond what any of us had initially anticipated. What had begun as an investigation into one man's pattern of marital fraud evolved into the unraveling of an extensive criminal network operating across multiple states and international boundaries. The morning after our coffee shop meeting, Agent Farisai, Collins arrived at the safe house where I'd spent the night with news that shifted the entire investigation. "We've been monitoring all of Marcus's communications since your confrontation," she explained, spreading photographs across the table. "Last night, he made contact with these individuals. The images showed three people I'd never seen before, two men and a woman, all professionally dressed and captured by surveillance cameras at various locations around Chicago. Jack Mercer, former investment banker with a history of securities. Fraud," Collins said, pointing to the first photo. "Elena Vasquez, expert in identity creation with ties to several document forgery operations, and Peter Keating, cybersecurity specialist with a sealed juvenile record for hacking." His team, I realized. Not just accomplices, partners. Collins nodded. "Based on their electronic communications, we believe they've been working together for at least 7 years. Marcus isn't just a lone con man. He's part of a sophisticated operation that targets high-net-worth professionals, primarily women, across the country." This revelation changed everything. The careful predator I'd married wasn't acting alone, but was part of a coordinated criminal enterprise with specialized roles and established protocols. "The good news," Collins continued, "is that your counteractions have forced them to communicate more explicitly than they normally would. Marcus is scrambling to contain the situation, which means they're making mistakes. Over the next 3 days, I worked directly with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, helping them decode the complex money movement patterns that Marcus and his associates had established. My expertise in forensic accounting proved invaluable as we traced funds through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. It's like looking at a twisted mirror of legitimate corporate structures, I explained to the investigative team as we mapped the network on a digital whiteboard. They've created something that resembles normal business operations on the surface, but is designed exclusively for concealment and quick liquidation. By tracking the money flowing out of our accounts, we identified 16 additional victims. Across 5 states, women whose lives had been systematically dismantled by Marcus and his team over the past decade. The combined financial damage exceeded $15 million, with emotional costs that couldn't be calculated. "We need to contact all of them," I insisted during a strategy meeting. "Not just as witnesses, but to help them recover whatever we can." "Agent," Collins agreed. "We're already working on it, but it's complicated. Many of these women were threatened into silence or manipulated into believing they were somehow at fault. Some have rebuilt their lives and are reluctant to revisit the trauma." I thought of Rebecca Winters and her years of living in fear after trying to pursue justice alone. What if I spoke to them? Not as an FBI agent, but as someone who's been exactly where they are? This led to the creation of what the FBI termed Operation Heartbreak, a coordinated effort to not only build a case against Marcus and his associates, but to provide support and recovery options for all their victims. 6 days after my birthday, I sat in a secure conference room at the FBI field office, facing 5 women who had each been married to Marcus under different names. Despite their diverse backgrounds, a surgeon, an architect, a tech entrepreneur, a professor, and a restaurant owner, their stories followed the same devastating pattern. "He isolated me from my family first," said Kathleen the surgeon, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Made me believe they were jealous of our relationship, that they didn't have my best interests at heart. The financial control was so gradual I barely noticed," added Jennifer the professor. "Small suggestions at first about consolidating accounts for tax benefits, then increasingly taking over all financial decisions. When he disappeared, he left me not just broke, but deeply in debt," Grace the restaurateur said bitterly. "Credit cards I never knew existed, loans against my business, second mortgages. It took me 5 years to dig out from under it." I shared my own experience, explaining how my professional background had allowed me to recognize the patterns and set up countermeasures. Then I outlined what the FBI investigation had uncovered, not just about Marcus, but the entire organization. "This wasn't random," I explained. "They selected each of you specifically for your financial success, lack of close family connections, and professional demands that would make you less likely to notice financial inconsistencies. They studied you before the first approach, learning your vulnerabilities and creating a persona designed to appeal to you specifically." "It was all completely calculated?" Rebecca asked, the enormity of the deception clearly striking her anew. "Even the way he approached me at that charity event?" "Especially that," Agent Collins confirmed, joining our discussion. "Based on what?" "We've recovered from their communications. They plan these introductions meticulously. They create situations that appear to be chance meetings, but are thoroughly orchestrated." "What about the threats?" Grace asked quietly. "After he disappeared with my money, when I tried to pursue it legally, the break-ins, the threatening messages, my office being vandalized, was that him too?" Collins nodded gravely. "We believe Keating handles the cyber threats and surveillance, while Mercer manages the more direct intimidation. It's a systematic approach to ensure victims are too frightened or embarrassed to pursue legal action." The room fell silent as each woman processed what this meant, that their traumatic experiences weren't isolated incidents or personal failures, but part of a calculated criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of women. "What can we do?" Kathleen finally asked, her professional composure returning. "How do we stop them from doing this to anyone else?" Agent Collins outlined the legal process ahead, the statements they would need to provide, the evidence they could help authenticate, the timeline for potential prosecution. But I found myself thinking beyond the immediate legal case to the larger implications of what Marcus and his team had accomplished. "We need to do more than just testify," I said, suddenly. "We need to create a system to identify and prevent these kinds of operations before they can devastate more lives." The other women looked at me with varying expressions of interest and uncertainty. "What are you suggesting?" Rebecca asked. "A network," I explained, the idea taking shape as I spoke. "Not just for legal cooperation in this case, but an ongoing resource for information sharing, pattern recognition, and support. Between us, we have expertise in medicine, architecture, finance, academia, technology, and hospitality. We understand how these predators operate from the inside. We could use that knowledge to help others recognize the warning signs before it's too late." By the end of that meeting, the seeds of what would later become the Financial Abuse Recognition Network, FARN, had been planted. Not just a victim support group, but a sophisticated organization leveraging professional expertise to combat targeted financial predation. Meanwhile, the legal case against Marcus and his associates was building rapidly. The FBI had frozen more than 30 accounts across 12 financial institutions, recovered approximately $7.3 million in stolen funds, and assembled evidence of crimes ranging from wire fraud to identity theft, money laundering, and interstate stalking. 10 days after receiving divorce papers on my birthday, I returned to my home for the first time, accompanied by federal agents executing a search warrant. The house felt simultaneously familiar and alien, the physical space unchanged, but now revealed as merely a stage set for Marcus's elaborate performance. As agents methodically searched for evidence, I stood in what had been our bedroom, looking at the framed photos Marcus had carefully selected and placed throughout our marriage. Images of a loving couple that had never truly existed. A young agent approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Blackwell, we found something you should see." In Marcus's home office, behind a false panel in the closet, they had discovered a locked case containing multiple passports, driver's licenses, and credit cards in various names. His escape, identities, prepared and waiting. More disturbing were the detailed dossiers on 3 women living in Chicago. Professional, successful women who matched the profile of Marcus's previous targets. Future victims, already selected and researched. He was already planning his next marriages, Agent Collins said quietly, even while still married to you. I studied the photographs of these women, a venture capitalist, a neurosurgeon, and a software company executive, feeling a strange mixture of anger and relief that they would be spared the experience the rest of us had endured. "We need to warn them," I said firmly. "Not just about Marcus specifically, but about how these operations work." Collins nodded. "We will. And with your help, we'll do more than just warn them. We'll shut down this entire operation permanently." The scope of our case had expanded far beyond one man's betrayal to encompass a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting successful women nationwide. And as difficult as the journey had been, I knew that exposing this network would protect countless potential victims from experiencing the same devastation. 2 weeks after my birthday, as the FBI built their case against Marcus and his partners, I returned to my daily routine with caution. Though Marcus was under surveillance, his associates remained at large, presumably working to recover from the exposure of their operation. "We need to maintain the appearance of normalcy," Agent Collins advised during our morning briefing call. "They're watching you as closely as we're watching them. The more routine your behavior, the more likely they are to make a mistake." Following this guidance, I resumed my work at CyberShield, focusing on current cases while assisting the FBI investigation after hours. The fragile normality was shattered on a Wednesday afternoon when my assistant rushed into my office, her face pale. "Olivia, someone's broken into your car in the parking garage." Security footage showed a slim figure in maintenance coveralls efficiently jimmying my car door, but the cameras mysteriously malfunctioned before capturing the person's face. Nothing was stolen. Instead, something had been left behind. A single playing card on my driver's seat, the Queen of Hearts, torn precisely down the middle. "It's Elena Vasquez," Agent Collins confirmed after examining the footage. "This is her signature, the torn queen. It's both a warning and a message." What's she trying to say? That they see you as the heart of the operation against them, and that they intend to tear your life apart. The implied threat elevated our security protocols immediately. I was assigned a protective detail and moved to another safe house. Despite these precautions, the incident marked the beginning of an escalating campaign of intimidation. My work email was compromised, with client communications altered in ways that could have damaged my professional reputation had my team not caught the changes. My mother received photographs of me entering the FBI field office, accompanied by a note questioning my mental stability. Most alarmingly, detailed information about my daily schedule was sent to my home address, proving they could reach me despite federal protection. "They're getting desperate," Agent Collins reassured me during an emergency meeting. "These are calculated attempts to frighten you into backing down." "They're succeeding," I admitted, my hands shaking slightly as I reviewed the latest threat assessment. "Is this worth it? Should I just walk away? Let Marcus keep what he's taken?" Collins's expression hardened. "That's exactly what they want. What they've counted on from every victim before you. Fear is their most effective tool." She was right, of course. The pattern had worked repeatedly. Isolate the victim, take their money, then intimidate them into silence. Walking away now wouldn't just mean surrendering my own justice. It would abandon all the other women who had finally found the courage to come forward. "What do we do?" I asked. "They're clearly willing to escalate beyond financial crimes." "We accelerate our timeline," Collins replied. "We have enough evidence to move on the entire network. We just need to coordinate across multiple jurisdictions." The next 72 hours were a blur of activity as federal prosecutors prepared to file charges and execute arrest warrants in 3 different states simultaneously. The operation required precise timing to ensure none of Marcus's associates could warn the others. The night before the planned arrests, I received an urgent call from Agent Collins. "We have a problem. Marcus has disappeared." Despite round-the-clock surveillance, he had managed to slip away during a scheduled court appearance, using a distraction created by Elena Vasquez to evade his FBI tail. "How is that possible?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "They had help from inside the courthouse, a security guard whose sister works with Keating. We're tracking all possible exit routes, but he has at least a 2-hour head start." Terrible thought struck me. If he's running, he'll need money. And he knows all my accounts are being monitored. The realization hit us simultaneously. "The house," Collins said urgently. "Check your home security system, now." I pulled up the app on my phone, hands trembling as I navigated to the live feed. The cameras showed nothing unusual until I accessed the view of my home office. There, methodically going through my desk drawers, was Marcus. "He's looking for your emergency cash," Collins concluded. "Our profilers anticipated he might have discovered your safe room during your marriage." She was right. Early in our relationship, before I understood who he truly was, I had shown Marcus the hidden compartment in my office where I kept emergency cash, a spare passport, and family heirlooms. A standard precaution for someone in my line of work, but now potentially a critical mistake. "I'm sending units to your house immediately," Collins said. "Do not, under any circumstances, go there yourself." But even as she spoke, I was already grabbing my keys. The safe room contained more than just cash. It held evidence I hadn't yet shared with the FBI, documentation that could unravel everything if Marcus found it. I couldn't risk losing the final pieces that would ensure justice for all his victims. "I'll meet the agents there," I lied, already heading for my car. "Olivia, this is exactly what they want," Collins warned, but I had already ended the call. The rational part of my brain knew I was making a dangerous mistake, walking directly into a confrontation with a desperate man who had nothing left to lose. But after months of careful planning and calculated responses, something more primal had taken over. A need to face the predator who had spent years manipulating my life. As I drove toward the house I had once shared with a man who never truly existed, I knew I was heading for the final confrontation that would determine whether Marcus's long history of exploitation would finally end, or claim one more victim. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I approached my neighborhood, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I parked 2 blocks away from my house and called Detective Rivera, who had been working with the FBI on the local aspects of the case. "Marcus is at my house," I whispered. "I'm nearby. How quickly can you get here?" 10 minutes at least," Rivera replied, his voice tense. "Olivia, wait for backup. Do not approach the house alone." "He'll be gone in 10 minutes," I said. and so will evidence that could help the other victims recover their money. I ended the call and approached my house cautiously, staying in the shadows of the large oak trees lining the street. The house appeared quiet, with only a faint light visible through the curtains of my home office. As I reached the side gate, I hesitated, suddenly aware of the foolishness of my impulsive decision. Marcus was cornered and desperate, potentially more dangerous than he had ever been. Before I could reconsider, a noise from the back of the house caught my attention. I moved silently along the garden path, years of training and evidence collection making my footsteps nearly silent on the flagstones. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus frantically searching through cabinets, pulling out false bottoms I had installed years ago for emergency cash reserves. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the kitchen door with my key and stepped inside. "Looking for something, Marcus?" He spun around, surprise quickly replaced by a calculated calm. "Olivia, I was wondering if you'd show up." "In my own house? Where else would I be?" I kept my voice steady, despite the hammering of my heart. Marcus looked different, hair cropped. Short, designer clothes replaced by nondescript attire suitable for someone trying to disappear. But his eyes were the same, constantly calculating, assessing the situation for advantage. "You've made quite a mess of things," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the scattered papers and open drawers. "All this could have been so simple. A clean divorce, a fresh start for both of us. A clean divorce where you take everything and disappear? That kind of simple?" He shrugged, as if we were discussing a minor disagreement rather than systematic fraud. "It's just money, Olivia. Insurance companies, banks, they would have covered most of your losses. Was all this really worth destroying lives over?" "That's rich, coming from you," I replied, anger rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "How many lives have you destroyed, Marcus? Or should I call you Michael? Matthew? We've identified at least 16 women so far." A flicker of something, perhaps genuine surprise, crossed his face. 16? Your FBI friends have been busy. They're just getting started. Every day we find more victims, more evidence, more accounts. Your entire network is being dismantled as we speak. Marcus moved casually toward the doorway leading to the hallway, and I realized he was positioning himself between me and the exits. Yet here you are, alone, confronting a man you claim is so dangerous. Why is that, Olivia? What's so important that you'd risk your safety? "Justice," I said simply. "Not just for me, but for all the women you've targeted." He laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl. "Justice? Do you really think any of this will end well for you? Elena and the others won't stop. They've invested too much in our operation to let one woman bring it down." "It's not just one woman anymore," I countered. "It's all of us. Every victim, every investigator, every prosecutor. You've lost, Marcus. Even if you get away tonight, there's nowhere you can hide that we won't eventually find you." His expression hardened as he reached into his jacket pocket. I tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead he withdrew a flash drive. "Insurance policy," he explained, holding it up. "Details on every operation, every partner, every account. Things even your precious FBI doesn't know about. My ticket to a very comfortable witness protection arrangement, once I make the right deal." The sound of distant sirens reached us and Marcus's expression tightened. "Time to go. I'd say it's been fun, but you're not going anywhere," I stated firmly, blocking his path to the kitchen door. "It's over." For a moment we stood facing each other, predator and prey turned hunter, as the sirens grew louder. Then Marcus made his move, lunging toward me with unexpected speed. I reacted instinctively, stepping aside while extending my foot to trip him. He crashed into the kitchen island, the flash drive flying from his hand and skittering across the floor. We both dived for it simultaneously, colliding awkwardly on the tile floor. Marcus was stronger, but I was fighting with the determination of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. As we struggled, The back door burst open, filling the kitchen with shouts and the harsh beams of tactical flashlights. "Police! Freeze!" Detective Rivera and 2 officers rushed in, weapons drawn, as Marcus was pinned beneath me, his fingers just inches from the flash drive. "Perfect timing," I gasped, rolling away from Marcus as the officers secured him. Rivera helped me to my feet, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. "I told you to wait for backup." "I did," I replied, brushing myself off. "You're here, aren't you?" As Marcus was handcuffed and read his rights, I picked up the flash drive that had nearly cost me everything. Whatever it contained, legitimate evidence or elaborate bluff, it was now one more piece in the case against him and his associates. "It's really over?" I asked Rivera quietly as they led Marcus away. "It's over," he confirmed. Elena Vasquez was arrested an hour ago in Detroit. Peter Keating surrendered without incident in Seattle. Jack Mercer is still at large, but his accounts have been frozen, and we have alerts at every border crossing and airport. For the first time in months, I felt the tight knot of tension in my chest begin to loosen. The man who had systematically targeted me, and so many others, was finally facing justice. The months following Marcus's arrest blurred together in a whirlwind of legal proceedings, evidence reviews, and rebuilding my life from the foundation up. The case against him and his associates moved with unusual speed through the federal system, fueled by the overwhelming evidence we had gathered and the testimonies of multiple victims across several states. 4 months after my birthday, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Marcus, now officially identified as Michael David Reynolds, as he listened to the judge pronounce his sentence. 28 years for multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. His accomplices received similar sentences, effectively dismantling the network that had preyed on successful women for nearly a decade. "Ms. Blackwell," the judge said, turning to address me directly after the sentencing, "this court recognizes the extraordinary courage and resourcefulness you demonstrated throughout this ordeal. Your actions have not only secured justice for yourself, but have provided closure for numerous other victims." I nodded my acknowledgement, feeling strangely hollow despite the victory. The pursuit of justice had consumed me so completely that reaching the end left an unexpected emptiness. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for statements from prosecutors and victims. I slipped away quietly, preferring to process the moment in private. Rebecca Winters caught up with me at the bottom of the courthouse steps. "You're not staying for the press conference?" she asked. "I've had enough public exposure to last a lifetime," I replied with a tired smile. "Besides, this victory belongs to all of us." Rebecca studied me for a moment. "What will you do now?" It was a question I'd been avoiding. My marriage, even as a sham, had defined my life for years. The investigation had consumed me after that. Without either, who was I now? "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted. "Return to my career, I suppose. Try to find some normalcy." "Normalcy sounds terribly boring after all this," Rebecca said with unexpected humor. "Have you considered something more meaningful?" The following week, I took my first real step toward answering that question. I filed paperwork to legally restore my maiden name, Olivia Blackwell, shedding the last remnant of the identity Marcus had imposed on me. I sold the house with its complicated memories and purchased a modern apartment downtown, closer to my office and filled with furniture and art that reflected my true tastes rather than the carefully curated aesthetic Marcus had preferred. Most significantly, I took a 6-month sabbatical from CyberShield to help establish what would become the Financial Abuse Recognition Network. Working with Rebecca, Grace, and the other survivors, we created an organization dedicated to identifying patterns of financial exploitation and providing resources for victims. Financial abuse leaves scars that aren't visible, I explained during our first public symposium, addressing an audience of law enforcement officers, financial institutions representatives, and social workers. The damage goes beyond stolen. money, or ruined credit scores. It undermines a person's sense of judgment, their ability to trust, their very understanding of reality. For the first time, I spoke publicly about my own experience, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor offering insight. Each speech, each training session, each consultation transformed my personal trauma into professional expertise that could protect others. 6 months to the day after Marcus's sentencing, I stood in my new office at Farn headquarters, looking at the framed photograph on my desk. It showed all 16 of us, the women who had been victimized by Marcus and his associates, standing together on the courthouse steps after the verdict. Not broken, not defeated, but transformed into a powerful force for change. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Collins. Just got word, Jack Mercer apprehended in Argentina. The last one down. Thought you should know. I smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with justice. The chapter of my life that had begun with a marriage built on lies had ended with something unexpected, a community of strength and a renewed sense of purpose. The woman who had received divorce papers on her birthday was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and determined to ensure that predators like Marcus would find fewer victims and face swifter consequences. 1 year after Marcus's arrest, I stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional committee on financial crimes. The journey from private victim to public advocate had been unexpected, but felt increasingly like the path I was meant to follow. Financial predators succeed not because of their brilliance, but because of our silence, I testified. They rely on victims feeling too embarrassed, too defeated, or too frightened to speak out. By changing that dynamic, we change the equation that allows these criminals to thrive. The Financial Abuse Recognition Network had grown beyond our initial vision, evolving from a support group into a powerful advocacy organization with branches in 12 cities. We had helped identify 3 additional fraud rings operating with similar methodologies, leading to multiple arrests and the recovery of millions in stolen assets. More importantly, we had created a system that allowed financial institutions to recognize patterns of exploitation before victims lost everything. Our red flag protocol was being implemented by major banks across the country, with specially trained staff intervening when account activities matched known predatory patterns. After my testimony, Senator Eleanor Markham, herself a former prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, approached me. Your organization has accomplished more in 1 year than most advocacy groups achieve in a decade, she observed. Have you considered expanding your focus to include policy reform? That conversation led to the next phase of my work. Collaborating with legislators to strengthen laws against financial exploitation and remove barriers to prosecution. The Reynolds Act, named with bitter irony after Marcus's true identity, created new legal frameworks specifically addressing relationship-based financial fraud. On the 2nd anniversary of receiving those divorce papers, I returned to Chicago to speak at a conference for financial security professionals. My keynote address, Predatory Patterns Recognizing the Architecture of Financial Abuse, drew on case studies from dozens of victims who had come forward after learning about Farn. What these criminals fear most isn't prosecution, it's exposure, I explained to the packed auditorium. They operate in shadows, relying on isolation and shame to silence their victims. By creating communities of survivors willing to share their experiences, we shine light into those shadows. After the conference, a young woman approached me tentatively. Ms. Blackwell? I think I might be in a situation similar to what you described. His explanations about our finances have stopped making sense, and when I ask questions, he becomes defensive or makes me feel stupid. This was the true measure of our success. Not just helping victims recover, but preventing new victims through education and early intervention. I connected her with our Chicago office for a confidential consultation, knowing that whether her concerns proved founded or not, she would receive the support and information she needed to protect herself. That evening, I met Rebecca, Grace, and Kathleen for dinner at a restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan. What had begun as a support group had evolved into deep friendship. Our shared trauma transformed into a powerful bond. "To unlikely beginnings," Grace proposed, raising her glass in a toast. "And unexpected strength," Rebecca added. As we clinked glasses, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us together. The man who had intended to destroy our lives had instead created a force for change that would protect countless others from experiencing what we had endured. I had received divorce papers on my birthday and discovered emptied accounts. A day that should have marked my devastation. Instead, it had become the first day of a life more meaningful and impactful than I could have imagined. The legacy of Marcus's betrayal wasn't ruined lives or stolen fortunes. It was a network of survivors transformed into advocates, a system designed to recognize exploitation before it succeeded, and a community dedicated to ensuring that financial predators found fewer victims and faced swifter justice. Sometimes, the most powerful transformations begin with our greatest challenges. Sometimes our deepest wounds become the source of our most important work. And sometimes, the ending someone else plans for you becomes the beginning you never knew you needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.